Today's event is one of the special pleasures of directing a center here at Princeton. As I think everyone has probably realized, one of the benefits from being a center director is that you can invite to come give talks and welcome them here to New Jersey. But the best kind of talk that we have is when we bring a former student and a former fellow back to Princeton to celebrate the publication, many years of their labor, and indeed a book which is especially timely today as we hear about the Persian Gulf, the Straits of Hormuz, Kharag Island, and many other places that figure into this book on a daily basis. It's my pleasure to welcome Lindsey Stephenson back to Princeton. Lindsey earned her PhD right here in the Department of Near Eastern Studies, and she was one of our postdoctoral fellows at the Mossavar-Rahmani Center. Fellows, this is proof that you can finish your books and bring them out. You can cross to the other shore. Apologies to Lindsey, I already made that joke, but I didn't make it with a microphone in my hand, so now I get to make it again.
As long as there's no blockade.
I took all my war jokes out, so... But anyway, as everyone I'm sure knows already, Lindsey is a social historian of the Middle East, the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, and today she's here to discuss her new book, which you can see on the slide, which was published with Stanford University Press in January. It's a fascinating look at how the creation of modern state borders in the 20th century transformed the historically fluid and intertwined lives of those who moved between the Iranian and the Arab shores of the Gulf. A work which the importance of which is especially poignant today as borders in this region and matters related to borders are directly affecting so many people's lives. Before I hand the floor over to Lindsey, just a quick announcement. We have a couple of events planned this week in conjunction with this celebration of Lindsey's work. Sort of publicly, I would also just encourage anyone who has the time tomorrow afternoon. We're very, very lucky to be joined by the creator of this beautiful cover image for Lindsey's book, who is Zahra Marwan, an immensely talented Kuwaiti-American artist who has created this cover and who will be doing a workshop in our Kargah series tomorrow at 4:30. So for anyone who's interested in that, please have a look at iran.princeton.edu and you can find the details there. Okay, without any further ado, without any more tasteless jokes, please join me in welcoming Lindsey Stephenson for today's talk.
Thank you, Dan. I must always start with a note of gratitude for the center for inviting me today and for all of you for showing up. It's just to see faces that have been along this journey for so many years now is really heartwarming and it's really special. Thanks especially to Allison and to the fellows who've been working to put together this series of events, which for me feels like just a celebration at every point. So please join us for those. I'm really overjoyed to be here to talk about my book, Belonging on Both Shores. And like Dan said, Zahra's here. It's an honor to have her here. In my book, I really try to pull out the local, everyday connections in the Gulf that illuminated everyday life. And the fact that Zahra's work here just feels like a full moment because her artwork comes from her own beautiful and difficult story. And so it feels like the perfect piece to be gracing the cover. So thank you to Zahra for the art and also for being here to celebrate with us. A few months ago, when I started thinking about this talk, I was planning to begin by telling you about an article that I found in The Economist this past summer called Forbidden Fruit. The article exposed what we were meant to read as a scandalous story. It revealed that Dubai secretly relied on Iranian produce. Iran now supplies 9 out of 10 cauliflowers, tomatoes, and watermelons imported by the UAE from Iran. It went on to say that the story is similar, but on a smaller scale in Oman and Qatar. In truth, the southwestern shores, I'm calling them southwest, you could call them, depending on how you look at the map, you can call them lots of things. So the Dubai section of the shores have always relied on the northern shores for produce, among other types of food. From our vantage point in the American empire, though, interdependence between the shores of the Gulf is supposed to be dangerous and scary. But my hope is that today you will leave with a totally just unamused by this kind of story. Interdependence and interconnectedness is the default. It's not the story. Now, unfortunately, the more relevant story now is much darker than the forbidden fruit. In recent weeks, the US and Israeli onslaught of Iran and the interconnectedness of the Gulf in that crisis has become apparent. What happens to the southern shores of Iran happens to the rest of the Gulf. The threat of radiation released from a spent nuclear fire in Bushehr, up there, is more dangerous to Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates than it is to the rest of Iran. Close proximity of the shores has also, unfortunately, meant that the Arab Gulf countries have been a launching site for strikes on Iran and a recipient of reciprocal strikes. Now, I mention this now not because I'm interested in weighing in on current events, but I just want everyone to realize that the atrocities of the war reverberates inside of many of us as I speak about this subject. So yes, it is timely, but it's also very raw. The subject of this talk will bring up sharp pangs of sadness, anger, fear, and grief, and it's important that we all recognize and hold that. But I hope that it also brings up feelings of hope and the remembrance that neighbors must always find a way to live with one another. And with that, we begin our story. No house, no job, no pass, no Arabic. When the British officials stationed in Bahrain rounded up vagrants in 1938, these were the criteria upon which they evaluated the legality of their belonging. These criteria, their lack of house, job, pass, and Arabic, were used as bases to deport the so-called vagrants. The criteria were full of ironies, double standards, and general ignorance. Upon being detained, many of the vagrants asserted entirely different criteria for their belonging. I am known here. I've worked here for so-and-so for X number of years. I was born here. My entire family lives here. These were a few of their responses. Most of the vagrants had been living in Bahrain much longer than the officials who apprehended them, and many had been there since even before the introduction of the traveling passes that now they were supposedly missing. The expectation of having a regular job was also preposterous. Much of the local economy, including British infrastructure projects, relied on the day labor that these vagrants provided. Even the nature of residence on the island was fluid. Much of the population was residing in palm frond structures called barastis, like this. This is a kind of fancy one, just so you know. Sleeping on the beaches, that's why they took a picture of it, otherwise it wouldn't be worthy of the photograph. Or they were temporarily housed by their employer. For the vagrants, all of these incriminating accusations, no house, no job, no pass, no Arabic, were simply everyday realities, and certainly not grounds for deportation. But in the 1930s, the sands were beginning to shift. The majority of those apprehended had come from just across the water, from the shores of Iran, and were given the blanket label Persian, signaling their subjecthood to Persia or Iran. They were labeled foreigners and threatened to be sent back home. And yet they spoke the same dialects as many of the leading merchants in Bahrain. The numerous letters and petitions on behalf of these vagrants in Arabic and English that accompany this record in the archive suggest deep local connections. So what exactly is going on? In Belonging on Both Shores, I interrogate and unpack some of the questions that this small anecdote raises. Who were the vagrants, and why were they mostly Persians? If they were so connected and had been in Bahrain so long, what were the circumstances that caused them to suddenly unbelong? And what exactly was the role of the British in all of this? What I argue is that the answers lie in the transformation of space and place that is happening in the early 20th century. Persians are, at the time, the most mobile group of people in the Gulf. Traveling back and forth across the water, they get caught up in some specifically 20th century frictions, what I call the triple entanglements of global markets, external intervention, and new technologies. But to give you some sense of what I mean by these terms, global market sort of encapsulates global trade and demand for local goods, the presence of European firms, economies of scale, etc. External intervention refers to, specifically in this case, the British Empire and the Iranian Central State, and new technologies encompasses steam, print, factories, but also an expanded sense of technology, like the technology of law or paperwork. And as I continue, you'll see these facets popping up in different ways. In Belonging on Both Shores, I show how the interplay between mobile Iranian actors and these entanglements produced particular kinds of transformations of space and place that shaped modern Gulf society. My book details this transformation in a range of arenas, from territorial geography, institutions, and the built environment, all the way down to food culture. Although modernity in the Gulf is often seen as a product of oil revenue, situated in the pre-oil period, this book demonstrates that a new Gulf was already taking shape long before the discovery of oil in the 1930s. Today, I want to walk you through a couple of themes that appear in the book that help us chart this interplay between Iranian migrants and the triple entanglements, how they negotiate these new forces that they encounter. So we'll have some stories related to these negotiations, new trades, new routes, and questions, wonderings about a new community. Oh, before we get into all of these details, let's set the background for our story. Up until now, I've only mentioned the Gulf, but our story is connected to a much broader context. Just as I've said, the opposite shores of the Gulf are intertwined and interdependent, so too was the entire Persian Gulf on the broader and western Indian Ocean region, which we have here. So the western Indian Ocean encompasses the Persian Gulf, Gulf of Oman, Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, and all of these shores around here. What makes this area a region is that for centuries it was held together through dynamic trading networks. In the late 19th and early 20th century, on an annual basis, local wooden ships would sail from the northernmost point of the Gulf waters at Basra, up here, along the coastline to Bombay in India, or Zanzibar in East Africa, and make their way back. Guided by the seasonal monsoon winds, ships were away for many months on end. Stopping at major ports along their route to do trade, the coastal travel formed a circuit connecting distant shores. So they're just going like along the shores and back. They're not necessarily going across the water too much. This is one of the large boats that would make this kind of journey. But most ships in the Gulf were not setting out on this long voyage. Smaller ships formed shorter networks where flows of travel were more dynamic. They didn't rely on seasonal winds, and they were not at sea for more than a few days or a week at a time. They sailed along the coast and across smaller bodies of water, like the Gulf, forming clusters of interaction. These connections were more intimate, more frequent, and smaller in scale in terms of trade, but larger in scale in terms of the number of people engaged in it. Still, these types of movements, the broad circuits across the entire Western Indian Ocean and this short back and forth across smaller spaces like this, were not totally separate from one another. As the larger ports of the Gulf primarily served as entrepôts, any bulk goods brought from connections from farther afield were redistributed through smaller networks. So, for example, a large ship might bring in many tons of rice from India, which would then be brought from India into one of these ports and then loaded onto smaller ships and then transferred around to smaller towns nearby. This frequent movement across the Gulf facilitated the binding together of life on opposite shores. It was due to this close relationship of constant contact that we find so many Iranians throughout the ports on the southern shores of the Gulf. Politically speaking, the ports of the Gulf were ruled by independent rulers. Polities were historically dynamic, and rulers were often changing, as were trading centers. Archaeologists have documented the shift in centers from Rishar, which is around here, to Siraf, to Sohar, and back to Hormuz between the 8th to the 16th centuries. But this dynamism began to change in the 19th century as the British Empire began to solidify control in the Western Indian Ocean. Some areas were officially ruled by the British Empire and others included in their informal empire. In the Gulf region in particular, what began as protecting trade interests between India and Iraq, specifically of the East India Company, in the 18th century, turned into extensive British control or influence by the 20th. One by one, along the coast of the Persian Gulf, the British contracted protection treaties with local rulers. In exchange for protection, the sheikdoms had to turn over their external affairs to Britain. The sheikhs were not allowed to lease or sell any piece of their land to a foreign country. They were not allowed to meet foreign representatives, and any foreigners residing in the territory were under the legal purview of British officers there. The British imperial presence in the Gulf encouraged the entrance of British, American, and other European firms into daily life and drew the region into new markets, new scales of trade, and new technology. In the first decades of the 20th century, the port towns of Kuwait and Bahrain, which feature in my story, were booming. Pearl revenues were soaring, the British were settling in, and swaths of good and people followed. In this moment, the narrative of progress led the British colonial officials to believe that new technologies and systems they introduced were bound to supplant the backwards ways of these traditional societies. Now connected to European steamship lines and global capital, Gulf societies were destined to benefit from economies of scale. But there was an important intermediary period that was clunky, as technology and capital alone could not meet the demands of these growing cities. The introduction of steamships also created particular gaps of scale along the Persian Gulf. Steamships could carry more goods farther and faster than could wooden sailing ships, but steamships could not dock at many of the ports. Laboring bodies were needed to temper a number of imbalances between modern technology and the town's pre-modern infrastructure and organization. This is where the Iranian migrants enter our story. With most of the men working at sea, pearling in the summer months and on this long-distance voyage in the remainder of the year, there was a need for workers who would build the towns and distribute the newly affordable luxuries. Iranians, with their small boats, capable of crossing the Gulf, began working in the lighterage trade. These small dhows, which were supposed to become obsolete, by the way, were critical for bridging the gap between steamships anchored sometimes miles out at sea and the port for which the cargo of the steamship was destined. These small lighterage dhows were the only way to transfer cargo from the steamships to the port. But the gap didn't end there. Once the cargo again reached land, a local solution was needed to distribute the goods throughout the narrow, unpaved alleys. And I'm sorry for the poor quality of these images. It was the bodies of men who unloaded the ships and distributed the cargo on foot throughout the town. These laborers were overwhelmingly new migrants from across the water. The Iranian laborers, called Amal, often found work on a daily basis. In both Kuwait and Bahrain, the day laborers were dock workers and porters, builders, rock breakers, fish cleaners, and water carriers. Because they worked depending on what was needed, the same person might work as a porter one day and a rock breaker the next, and the builder the following day. As much as the British officials in Bahrain disliked these day laborers, calling them vagrants and threatening to expel them, they also recognized their utility as occasional workers for the nascent oil company, or on days when many steamships needed to be unloaded. It was indeed by the toil of their unskilled hands that the modern Gulf began to take shape. In Bahrain, dock working was organized from the early 1900s under the auspices of the port landing contractor, who was an employee of the state. For decades, all of the men controlling port logistics were of Iranian origin and maintained ties to Iran through trade. They were also sponsors of new migrants who they brought to work on the docks. Iranians made up the majority of dock workers and porters in Kuwait as well. Until the 1920s, these hammals, as they called them, porters, originated from south-central Iran around Laristan, which is a place that most Iranians don't know exists. I'll refer to it on the map when I get there. And they were joined later by migrants from other parts of Iran. As the number of the hammals began to rise, new technologies were created to manage this population. In the 1930s, the Kuwaiti municipality issued a registration and permit system. All workers around the souk were required to wear this metal arm plate on their arms displaying their occupation and registration number. This armband is preserved by one of those Iranian families, and it's just in his house in Kuwait. One of the most precious commodities that the porters carried was water. As Kuwait town had essentially run out of fresh water by 1908, several new occupations emerged to bring water from the Shatt al-Arab to Kuwait and distribute it throughout the rapidly growing town. Now, the Shatt al-Arab, for the uninitiated, is this river here that starts from the divulgence of the Tigris and Euphrates River, just north of Basra. So they come together and they flow all the way down to the Persian Gulf. And this is fresh water, which is why they went there to get water. It divides Iran and Iraq until it empties into the Persian Gulf. For transporting water, people used these same coasting boats called tishalas, which were used for lighterage, as we saw, trading short distances, and navigating shallow waters, especially in the Shatt. Now, they also used the opportunity of going to the Shatt to bring back, scandalously, fruit and vegetables and passengers. And although the trade had already existed between Kuwait and villages along these towns, this routinization of the water trade, this need to constantly go back and forth, further bound the two shores together. One trade even specifically rose as like, I'm the fruit and vegetable runner, and that's tarah. So some people are tarah. And a lot of those tarah ended up coming to Kuwait in the 1930s and 40s. Now, there are multiple ways to look at the relationship between Iranian migrants in Kuwait. A well-known Kuwaiti historian, Al-Hijji, sees the immigration of Iranians in the early 20th century as the cause of the water shortage in Kuwait. But as we've seen, they also played a major role in alleviating the crisis. By 1933, more than 40 boats were constantly making the trip, fully dedicated to bringing fresh water from the Shatt, with four boats arriving daily. In 1939, the work of carrying water had been institutionalized through the creation of the Kuwait Water Company, which set up 3 areas along the coast where water could be collected. Again, that picture. So once the water arrived into the port, before they set up some collection areas, it would be carried on the shoulders of the laborers or by donkey and distributed throughout the town. So that's what this guy is doing here and there, these 2 guys. They have these tanks full of water. The people who did this work were, as far as I have seen, exclusively migrants from Iran. They were called kandaris, and their backbreaking labor has come to be memorialized as a great service to the country. It was several decades before the technology of the 20th century would solve the water shortage in Kuwait. Although the first desalination plant was running by 1919, the quality was poor, and the government continued to explore alternative sources of water. Thus, the manual transport of water by small local boats was the primary source of the country's fresh water and simultaneously a source of income for new migrants, until the completion of a major desalination plant in the early 1950s. New routes. Prior to the 20th century, people from Iran crossed the opposite shores of the Gulf for any number of mundane reasons. To get vegetables, as we've seen, to the simple trade, family visits, and fishing. And at that time, crossing the waters of the Gulf was similar to traveling by land to any other city inside of Iran, in that it didn't necessitate an encounter with state authorities on either side. There was no paperwork to be issued, processed, or stamped. Crossing the water was simply a matter of arriving safely on the other side. But as the numbers of people crossing and staying began to rise, evolving states became increasingly involved in the regulation and restriction of movement. As the 20th century progressed, there was increasing insistence that one had to arrive properly, that is, with one's papers in order. The objective of these external actors, both the British colonial officials and the Iranian central state, was to tame unruly mobilities. They did so through regulation, registration, and taxation. They used the law to direct flows towards spaces that they had the capacity to police. Passes such as these were issued only at ports where there was a government presence. This is obviously from the Iranian side. These were issued at Muhammara, Bushehr, Bandar Linge, and Bandar Abbas. But I'll just refer you to the map. That's okay. So Muhammara, Bushehr, Bandar Linge, and Bandar Abbas. They issued. The British issued their own traveling passes called certificates of identity. And again, they issued these at specific places where they were, where they had agencies in Kuwait, Manama, Abu Dhabi, and others further down. Although the people around the Gulf were entangled in these modern forces of regulation and documentation, they weren't completely tied down or helpless in the face of them. Locals, in fact, had important forms of traditional capital. The most important of which was familiarity. Intricate geographical knowledge and networks allowed the people of the region to circumvent both state borders and official markets. Because they knew the area from both the water and the land, rerouting was easy. Landing options for small dhows were many, spread out across a lengthy coastline. The people enforcing the borders were outsiders. They didn't know the intricacies of the territory they were policing, either from land or sea. As Johann Matthew succinctly put it, the littoral was a geographic margin, but continued to be a hive of activity that was sidelined only in the geographic imaginations of colonial officials. In many ways, Iranian migrant networks survived by operating at the margins of these territories and markets. They traveled on and operated ships that went unrecorded, entered territories undocumented, and some traded in illicit cargoes. When taxes and regulations were implemented at major port towns, movement and trade that had previously flowed through them simply shifted to smaller villages nearby. As migrants and traders avoided regulation by physically rerouting networks to areas where the state was less visible, the use of smaller local sailing vessels, generically referred to colonial officials as dhows, increased. Dhows easily landed almost anywhere along the shores, which is what they were built to do. Small boats were key for helping Iranian traders and migrants navigate these new entanglements of modernity. For example, in 1910, when duty on tea imports to Iran was 100%, very little tea passed through customs at Bushehr and Bandar Linge. Which were the two major coastal ports on the Iranian side. However, in the same year, the import of tea to Bahrain and Dubai increased dramatically, and the price of tea in Iran remained stable. Although they didn't have the resources to prove what was happening, the British political agents themselves realized that the tea was being smuggled by smaller boats to minor villages in Iran, or what they called minor villages. Seems pretty major. The same story repeated over and over again for all manner of goods. It wasn't just tea. It was gold thread, cloth, ink, all the things that you need in your daily life. So to avoid taxation and regulation, I'm just going to use my pointer here. There's Dubai, there's Linge. They just brought them here and sailed across to the other side. In Bushehr, it's a further distance, but still possible. One result of this was that the dhow traffic was reinvigorated at a time when colonial officials imagined these boats to be taken over by more faster and efficient steamships. Although colonial regulators saw dhows as a relic of traditional transportation and consequently as insignificant components of the modern world of trade, the colonial neglect allowed the dhows to carry goods and make profits in places and in trades that regulators deemed insignificant. A second result was the shifting centers of the Gulf from the Iranian coast in the 19th century from Bushehr and Bandar Linge to Bahrain and Dubai in the 20th century. Now, at the beginning of the talk, I mentioned Dubai's reliance on Iranian produce, but the relationship has been and continues to be symbiotic. The emergence of Dubai was largely built on Iranian merchants using it as a landing ground and entrepot to surreptitiously bring goods to the southern Iranian shores. The ability of Iranians to continue being mobile without being caught reminds us that although borders are conceived of and drawn on maps as lines, in practice, they are points. Physically, the state was not and could not be everywhere along the border, checking traveling passes and charging customs taxes. The gaps in enforcement of the border were seen by colonial and central state officials as their own shortcomings, whether due to limited resources, oversight, or exceptions. But I argue that we can see it in another way. It wasn't just that they had shortcomings. We should see it as a kind of advantage, a local advantage, possessed only by those who had deep belonging in the region. While the states of Bahrain and Iran busied themselves with emphasizing borders, setting up administrative and customs hurdles to weaken the connections between the two countries, the smuggling trade opened up, perhaps further deepening the connections between the literal port towns. Now, we've seen how the Iranians navigated the physical world and charted new ways forward, but I want to spend a few minutes considering something a bit more difficult to grasp. What impact did all of the entanglements have on their identities? Who were Iranians? How did they see themselves? Were they connected to each other? I would be remiss not to address why so far I have swept through an entire 1,000+ miles of coastline and to put all these people in a single category called Iranian. Now, simply put, I use this category just to avoid ethnic generalizations, which suits a bit more than Persian. By using Iran, I refer to geography without making unnecessary commitments to race or ethnicity. This is the same thing that Reza Shah did in 1935 when he changed the name of the country. It is my great line. When he changed the name of the country from Persia to Iran, he was trying to say we are all together in a different way. But still, either way, my claim or Reza Shah's, it's still problematic in that it glosses over difference, subsuming everyone into a single category. The British in our period classified everyone from these shores as Persian, much in the same way that I use Iranian. For them, this is how they related to the land, which is then officially Persia. In the nation-state paradigm, this use of a single marker tied to territory makes sense. There are citizens and non-citizens and categories connected to particular rights and obligations. But the reason why Iranian doesn't fit quite right is because it feels like a category ahead of its time for the 20th century Gulf. Anscombe, A History of the Ottoman Gulf, argues that in this period, the strongest elements of identity were those related to each person's daily experiences of family, bonds of social, economic, or political patronage, economic activity, and locale. We know that the migrants were from many different regions of Iran and different ethnic and linguistic groups. They were Arab, Baharna, Baluchi, Lori, Turkoman, Fars, and others. What's harder to ascertain is whether or not these categories that we use now were salient for them at the time. What we do know is that it was strategic for the British to lump all of the Iranians into a single category. Amidst a criminal incident involving an Iranian in 1904, the British officials in Bahrain claimed that all foreigners, including Iranians, fell under their jurisdiction. This was a subject of much debate between the British and the Bahraini ruler, who claimed that the Iranians should be under his patronage. Keeping foreigners under their jurisdiction was an important and long-term matter for the British for several reasons. They were primarily concerned with keeping other governments from getting involved in Bahrain. What they told the Iranian government was basically, we know you're busy in the north, like doing other things, so we'll just manage your people here. Like, don't worry about it. But this actually ended up helping Bahrain to acquire this territorial sovereignty that it might not have had otherwise by keeping the Iranians away. It also ensured that the Sheikh would not collude with other states to expel the British from Bahrain. The second benefit was that keeping the wealthy Persian merchants under their authority allowed the British more influence over Bahrain in general. Turning the Iranians of Bahrain into foreigners in need of protection was the first step in a process of infusing new official and legal understandings of belonging that were bound up with the bordering of the Gulf in the early 20th century. In asserting their jurisdiction over the Iranians, the British established a court for foreigners, which was presided over by the political agent, which is roughly to like a consul general. Appearance in the court determined whether someone was Iranian or Bahraini. Once anyone had a record in this court, they were forever Iranian. The operation of the court also had a way of controlling the leadership amongst Iranian migrants. For example, they selected arbiters for cases from among the small group of powerful Iranian merchants who were close to the British. They gave particular men the power to determine the affairs of their communities, while also ensuring their loyalty. The British agents further reinforced these communities by routinely supporting their appointment to the municipality council, the Majlis al-Urfi, and the commercial court. I'm not trying to scapegoat these guys, but really, a lot of them, this was them. I did not add the captions or anything, so don't hold me to that. But these are the guys that I'm talking about. So by becoming a patron of Iranians through legal jurisdiction, the British effectively eliminated these Iranians' possibility of joining local patronage structures, either through the ruler of Bahrain or the Arab tribes there. With British patronage or protection, the category of Iranian became fixed and separate from others living in Bahrain. In contrast, in Kuwait, where this separate court for foreigners did not exist, identities were more fluid. There were many accounts of people claiming to be Iranian or Kuwaiti, and the governments deciding that no, in fact, they were the other one. In some cases, having parents born in Kuwait was enough to make one Kuwaiti, and in others, it wasn't. It seems people in Kuwait especially appealed to different identities at the same time, kind of shopping around for the best deal. Outside of the court cases, we don't often get to hear from the migrants themselves weighing in on their identities. This feels like a very 21st century problem. There are a couple of moments when we see very interesting convergences of different Iranian groups in Bahrain, though. I mentioned previously that many of the Iranian migrants were employed as laborers. Charles Belgrave, a private British citizen working as an advisor to the Bahrain government, recalled hearing from dawn to dusk the monotonous song of the Persian masons building his house in 1925 when he first arrived. Unlike other trades, building was not represented by migrants from a single place. In fact, building was a collaborative space. One of the most fascinating results of interregional cooperation among Iranian builders were architectural structures that boasted combined cooling systems from the humid coast of Bushehr. This is the Bushehr building, which has windows, doors, and balconies with the cooling structures here, these bad gears, which come from around Banderlinge and the dry areas of Iran. Only in Bahrain, where migrants of these diverse backgrounds and skill sets work together, do we find the combined styles that have come to epitomize 20th century Gulf architecture. So you have in this one building, you have the verandas and the windows and the badgir. And this one is really wild because this whole thing is a badgir, but at the top it has the windows to make it look like it's a balcony. So that's really cool. Through networks of trade, there's one other thing I was going to say. So technological transfers also appeared at a micro level inside of the house, and just sort of anecdotally, and God knows if this is true, one Bushehri man that I talked to was telling me about how this Bestiki came to his house and they made a chute from the roof down to the bottom floor so that when they ground flour on the roof, it would come down to the kitchen. And for the Bushehris, that was like genius. That was one guy, not attested in many sources, but just food for thought. The collaboration of markedly different Iranian technologies and was one of the truly unique aspects of the Bahraini built environment. But what can we infer from this collaboration? Maybe it's just two friends working together, sharing ideas. It doesn't necessarily communicate a shared identity. One anecdote, and really the only moment when we hear Iranians speak about who they are, comes from communications about one of the first modern schools. Through networks of trade, which span from Bombay to Basra to Cairo, Gulf merchants were attuned to global conversations in both Arabic and Persian about Islamic modernity and modern education for Muslims. Around the Indian Ocean, aided by new technologies like steam and print, Muslim merchants came in contact with these ideas through religious teachers and through rapidly increasing numbers of publications and word of mouth on the street in Bombay. Eager to establish an alternative to the missionary schools that began popping up at the same time, they brought these ideas home to open new modern schools, sometimes recruiting teachers they met in major metropolises to teach their children. In 1913, Iranians from the Bushehr region of Bahrain here opened the first modern school. The school was deeply connected and perhaps modeled after another school, which was built in Bushehr in previous years. So within a year of the school opening, an article appeared in a well-known Persian newspaper called Habl al-Matin, which noted that another group of Iranians in Bahrain wished to join. The respectable Avazi, which doesn't really fit together if you know Persian, the respectable Avazi merchants had become jealous of the Irani school, and started to gather funds to build their own school. However, when the Avazis realized that the school had good teachers, they were and was engaged in brotherly tarbiyat and teaching Islam and stayed away from personal and sectarian issues, they were also interested in joining. Now, the article further says that the head Avazi merchant was the first to send his son to the school. So from this brief glimpse in 1914, we see that the Iranians of Bahrain at least identified themselves in two different ways, the Avazis and the Iranis. But together, they were ultimately held together by an Iranian identity. It suggests that because the Avazis were Sunnis, they were initially apprehensive about sending their children to the school. However, the pan-Islamic appeal convinced them to join. Who were the Avazis is a little bit trickier to say. The Bushehris, we know. The Avazis, it refers to this very complicated name here, Avaz, Evaz, and Awad in Arabic. But it's pretty deep into the interior. And we know that they were Sunnis, okay? And this whole region mostly is Sunnis. But it should be a little bit more complicated than Avazis, because it's not like a hop, skip, and a jump from Avaz to Bahrain. There's some first internal migration, probably first to Bastek and then down to Banderlinge and then over. But they were sort of grouped together. And I mean, this is the Iranis grouping them together as Avazis. These categories that they use also, interestingly, align with the categories that were later used by the British, although the British break them down even further. But what's interesting is that this joint effort occurs early in 1914, before the creation of the British court, which solidified their Iranian identity, legally at least, and before a strong wave of Iranian nationalism in the 20s. So the two groups saw themselves as distinct but connected through their Iranianness. Both groups were also deeply connected to Bahrain. There's also a case in Bahrain where the Iranians created their own school, which was deeply embedded in a local context. The school taught the usual modern classes, but they also taught Arabic alongside of Persian, and both were given their due importance. I pulled out this gem of a quote from the head of the school. "Persian should be pronounced as Persian and Arabic as Arabic," the mullah instructed in 1930, "and anyone pronouncing Arabic letters as Arabic while reciting a Persian text will have 1 point removed." So there was full respect for both languages in this school. He has many other great quotes. See me later, I can send them to you. So I'll end with this. One final document is perhaps instructive for mapping out just where Iranian belonging rested. In 1930, Ghulam Ali Jahromi, sorry, I keep putting the map here, but I feel like I always need it. Jahrom is in here, okay? Ghulam Ali Jahromi started to feel unwell and decided to write his will. He brought to his side a judge, 3 prominent Iranian merchants, 3 men from Jahrom, and an Arab Bahraini. With his modest estate, he divides his Iranian money, his toman, into 3 parts. One part is to go to repair a mosque in his hometown of Jahrom. One part is for the big Iranian Husseiniya in Bahrain. Husseiniya is like a spiritual gathering place. And then, among other things. And the third portion is for praying and fasting. Ghulam Ali, his will shows us that his heart and his life was divided. For Iranians in the Gulf, home was in 2 places. Like many of his fellow migrants, he belonged on both shores. His last words are helpful for processing some of what was happening with all of these different negotiations we've seen between Iranians and these entanglements. They avoided regulations that would pin them to a single place. They kept flows across the water alive, claimed multiple identities, reconstructed facades of home, created institutions that bound themselves to one another and to their homeland, and to the southern port cities of their residence. With each encounter, we find them trudging forward, always finding new ways to be at home in 2 places, and keeping the connections between the shores alive. Thank you.